Good morning. We have seen that for quite some time there has been a clear slowing of the international trade. Historically, international trade has tended to grow between 1.5 to 2%, twice as fast as GDP. But since 2012, it has been growing either at par with GDP and at times even lower than GDP internationally, globally. In 2016, for example, the world's largest shipping companies sold $120 billion worth of goods as compared to 2012 when $200 billion worth of goods were sold internationally. So what does it mean for globalization? Are the countries becoming exclusive? Are they withdrawing? And why is it that while the national economies are improving, international trade is decreasing? What does it mean for globalization? Is globalization, from the economic point of view, politically we have discussed somewhere else, but from economic point of view, does it mean any longer a valid concept? You see, there are various things which have to be considered. The international trade is shrinking, but not solely because of inclusiveness. The other factors, which are political and technological, they indicate that in the long term, anti-globalization has to come to an end. And this would create a very different world. The first issue is the technological development. The faster development, the changing pace, and the quantum of development in technology is bringing production and manufacturing closer to the final destination of goods, that's the end user. Today, technology has made it possible for all the manufacturing to be slowly decentralized and to save the expenses on insurance, freight, transportation, and allied ones. They want to manufacture goods, whether completely or in CKD, where the end user is. And one of the most contributing factors to this decentralization is energy. We have new strategies, new technologies for extracting oil. 4 years back, nobody thought of shale oil technology, which today is extremely important. Our increasing dependence on renewable energy to tackle climate change is also an enabling factor as far as relocation of production and manufacturing sites near the end user is concerned. And as technology improves in the field of energy, the dependence of United States and the European energy consumers on third-party countries, the result, the need to transport barrels of oil and tons of coal is reduced. In 1970, for example, 55% of the world trade was barrels of oil. Now, either the pipes are taking that oil, so the globalization trade has changed that direction. The shipping is not involved. Similarly, the shale oil production has made USA less dependent. It had sufficient reserves, but it never used them. It would import still from Canada and from Middle East. But now it's becoming energy independent in oil and natural gas. This has had a large impact on the international trade. Given its energy independence, USA may reduce its onerous role as a guarantor of maritime security. So the political situation is mingled with the economic situation, and the decrease in the oil imports naturally tells them, why should we care what happens in the high seas? The Coast Guard and the US Navy, which used to patrol the oceans to protect against piracy or to rescue those ships in the case of natural disaster, have decreased because there's less number of ships. And USA no longer holds the guarantee for protecting everything because its self-interest is not involved. And a large part of this role it has played since 1945 has been to ensure the transport of fossil fuels to the West. Another development, which is quite in infancy, though it's increasing at a galloping rate, is the impact of robotic development on international trade. As the fourth industrial revolution and its process of extreme automation spreads throughout our factories, robots become more efficient and more affordable. Practices that were the norm earlier, like manufacturing, shifting to the places where cheap labor was available, would decline. Now, for example, a textile manufacturer in USA need not locate the factories in Bangladesh, in Vietnam, in Philippines, because the labor is cheap there. They can purchase the robots and the robots will work. So they are saving on labor and also saving on the trips to those countries where the manufacturing was there for quality control. The episode of Bangladesh, when a 7-story building caught fire and 200 people were burnt to ashes, brought it home. That's not worthwhile having your manufacturing facilities abroad. You cannot control it, and the net result is that you lose. So imagine, why relocate a factory, as I said, to Poland or to Vietnam, if you can have the same production in California or in Berlin, and the robots are much more reliable, much more dependable, much more accurate and efficient, and they can work 24/7. No overtime payment, no payroll increases. And not only that, they are less demanding than the human workers. The fear of the unions, which is quite terrifying in the advanced countries, is being reduced by the increase of the robots. So millions of employees in the East, in Asia, and Africa are likely to lose their jobs. And I said the other day, if you remember, that 800 million jobs are likely to be lost by the year 2025. So just a few years more, that 800 million jobs is not a small number. And then, there's another change. Advances in the 3D printers. What happens is that with the advent of 3D printers, you don't need to have large factories. You can have much smaller ones closer to the consumer, and the manufacturing process is simplified because of the replication and reproduction of the models. There are other changes in artificial intelligence and technology, especially nanotechnology, that are coming. New materials can be manufactured near the consumer because they'll substitute our natural materials that need to be transported from the distant mines and deposits. So on the one side, the finished product is not being transported. The labor is not being used in the cheaper places. The nanotechnology and artificial intelligence makes, along with the 3D printers, makes clusters useless and individual manufacturing places near the end user viable and feasible. Earlier it used to be said that the scale of production is important. The larger the scale, the economies would be benefiting, because with the large scale, the expenditure correspondingly is less. That is no longer the case. So these changes are going to be more apparent in the next 10 years, and would also affect and impact the contracting process of trade. And then, can you ignore the politics? Just see Brexit, coming in of Trump, and rise of neo-nationalism. And the important sectors of the Western population now feel very strongly that they have been abandoned by globalization. That abandonment, the sense of abandonment in the West, is further hastening the decay of this concept. You see, the process of globalization has been there for a long time, but it got impetus when China entered WTO on December 11, 2001. And that was seen to be extremely positive sign for the humanity as a whole. This model of globalization consists of offshoring manufacturing to companies based on cost efficiency, primarily labor cost. There was one benefit definitely. It lifted millions of people out of poverty in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And it allowed countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, all the BRICS countries to develop significantly, to that extent that is quite probable now that India would be the third largest economy in the world in the next 5 years. During the last 17 years, China increased its GDP from 1.2 trillion to 11 trillion, which was a sign of historically unprecedented growth for any country of that size and that population. It was replicated in Vietnam. It was again replicated in India, and this model of globalization supported the growth of large multinationals. And now multinationals came in for criticism because of their size, because of their revenues, because of their propensity to use their profits to bribe political leaders and corrupt the political atmosphere. And the result was, as the globalization increased, the development of technology started decreasing the impact of globalization and also the advance of globalization. But that's not enough. It has been excellent for the consumers, globalization, nobody can deny it. The endless number of products could be made available to the consumers at very competitive prices. So which used to be considered as luxuries became comforts. What used to be deemed comfort became almost a necessity. Look at the cell phones. Could anybody have imagined that the people at the lowest rung of social order would be having cell phones? The first revolution was by transistor, then by the mobiles. But what happens is, the benefits are not noted in the industrial communities of America, in the mining and metallurgy areas of Liverpool or Manchester, or in the formally industrialized area of France, because their unemployment started. You see, there is a parity. When you shift the manufacturing from one place to the other, the place where it is shifted, there's prosperity. But from where it is shifted, it results in unemployment and consequent social disorder. So, the people of these communities, they were the backbone of the Western democracies. And it is their frustration, disgruntledness, and anger which resulted in the rise of populism and neo-nationalism. They were quite afraid, and rightly so, of the word they were losing grasp. These people started calling for tariffs and protectionism, and the leaders of any political party would take benefit of that. So they started making stricter rules for trade. Now, on one side, they were talking of the practices like TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. They were talking of the free trade. On the other side, they started applying protective duties. And with the protective duties, the distances grew. The mental gaps grew. And the international trade suffered. So this is a cycle which has started. The globalization increased international trade, and the increased international trade ultimately resulted in centrifugal forces. And those forces started the disintegration of the concept. International goods trade is based on offshore manufacturing, has come to cease to exist. It has to end. And therefore, the international trade will continue to be below GDP growth. Now, when the manufacturing clusters are near the end user, the growth is there. The GDP is growing, but the trade is being reduced. So, the basic concept of international trade to be 1.5 to 2 times more than the GDP is knocked off. We have to rework our concepts. It's not necessarily bad that the international trade is decreasing. But let's not forget that the international organizations that were created after the Second World War, like UNCTAD, they are losing their importance and also their relevance, because now we face different type of challenge. It's not globalization, it is ultimately sustainable development goals. So what we need is basically new concepts in migration, new ideas for major financial crisis, and investment protection and cyber security. Now, cyber security and investment protection would be the buzzwords for the next decade. And these buzzwords would further reduce the need and the desirability of globalization. So politically, it has been a disaster. Economically, it's on the way out. Definitely, the time has come to bid goodbye to globalization, because it's no longer relevant. Not because it's bad, but because it has lost all its relevance. And like all outmoded concepts, it must be buried. The sooner we do it, the better it would be. Thank you.